I am about to show you the top 5 decks currently in Clash Royale for December of 2021. With 13 cards being balanced earlier this month and a global tournament starting in less than a day, here are some of the hottest decks for you to run. Let's get right into it. Number 1. Mortar, Miner, Bait. Now, with the recent buff of both the Rascals and the Dart Goblin, Mortar Miner Bait is officially back and it is doing better than ever. This deck is all about applying cheap, quick pressure and getting consistent chip damage onto the opponent's tower. So starting off the match, I'm always going to be cycling some of my cheap cycle cards. May that be a Dart Goblin in the back, a Log at the bridge, or even a Miner to the safe spot of the opponent's arena towers. After that, it really comes down to reacting to what your opponent has to respond to that. Now, in terms of offense for this deck, there are actually a ton of different options, which makes this deck super versatile. First, you have the cheap Miner Bait push, with a Miner tanking and some spam units in the back, such as some Bats or a Dart Goblin. Secondly, you have a Mortar push. With this case, it is very important that you watch out for some spell value, because if you group your units up too much, your units are going to be very squishy, so you can give your opponents a lot of spell value. Finally, you have the counter push based offense, where once you have some surviving units on defense, you basically just pile everything in onto the offensive end. Moving on to the defense of this deck is where things can get a little bit sketchy. First off is the Mortar. When you're against certain matchups, especially beatdown, it's very important that you save the Mortar for mostly defensive purposes only, because you need some sort of way to distract those building targeting units. At the very core, this is a bait deck, so on the defensive end, you really want to try and bait out your opponent's small spells so that your other bait units will be able to get as much value as possible. Rascals and Miner are going to be your two main mini tanks. Guards are going to be a great way to distract, and then your Dart Goblin and your Bats are going to be your two main damage dealers. Again, I can't stress enough how important it's going to be to space your units out so that the opponent cannot get spell value. All in all, a very solid and fast deck with tons of different offensive options, so a solid deck to run in this current meta. Number 2. Classic Splash Yard. That's right, with the buff of the Ice Wizard having the Enter the Arena slow ability, Splash Yard is actually making a return in this new meta. So starting off with Splash Yard, this is a very heavily control-based deck. So you're always going to be starting off rather reactively, forming positive elixir trades on the defensive end, and then turning that into a successful counter push. At the start of the match, I'll generally either cycle a Tombstone or a Bar Barrel, or I'll just wait for my opponent to make the first play, and then I'll immediately start defending what my opponents have. For most pushes, you'll generally be able to use the Knight or the Bar Barrel as a mini tank, the Ice Wizard or the Baby Dragon as splash and air defense, and then the Tornado to group units together to give your splash unit extra value. Tombstone is there to distract tanks as well as high-hitting units such as the Prince or the P.E.K.K.A. And then the defensive poison is also very useful, so never be afraid to throw down a poison on the defensive end. Now, a great thing about this deck is because the Knight and the Baby Dragon are relatively tanky, after a successful defense, there's a very good chance that they will survive and you will be able to go in with a graveyard offense. So moving on to the offense of this deck, you're obviously going to want to have a tank for your graveyard. That may come in the form of a counter push with a surviving Knight or Baby Dragon, or it can be something really cheap, such as just a simple graveyard Bar Barrel push at the bridge. Either way though, on offense, it's also very important to utilize those spells. The poison is pretty self-explanatory. It can take out both cheap as well as medium health defensive units, but you can also use the Tornado as a way to get tower damage and take out the opponent's defensive options. This deck is also on the cheaper end as well, so once you get sort of in the driver's seat of the match, in double and triple elixir time, you can really start just cycling graveyards over and over again onto the opponent's tower. And since the graveyard is pretty much guaranteed to get 1 or 2 skeleton hits every single time, it's just going to be consistent damage over and over. Number 3. Miner Wallbreaker Cycle. Now, minor wall breakers has always been kind of in and out of the meta, but with the new Golden Knight and the recent buff of the Dark Goblin, this is currently the most popular version of a minor cycle deck. This is going to be a very fast and very aggressive deck, even more so than the Mortar bait deck that I shared earlier this episode. So starting off the match, I'm either cycling a miner to the tower, splitting my wall breakers in the center, or playing spear goblins at the bridge. I always want to begin the match as the aggressor, playing something to try to bait out the opponent's counters and get chip damage onto the tower. At the very core, this is going to be a chip style deck, so most of the times you're just going to be chipping damage slowly away from the opponent's tower, may that be a minor hit here and there, or even a wall breaker connection. In addition, you also have some insane offensive pressure with the Golden Knight. Adding on to that, you also have the poison that you can use on offense as well. Pretty self-explanatory, but in double and triple elixir time, you're going to really want to use the miner and the poison to get some very quick damage onto the opponent's tower. Moving on to the defensive end of this deck is where things start to get a little bit sketchy. And for pretty much all minor wall breaker decks, the first line of defense is always going to be offense. If the opponent has a push coming your way, just make a quick little push in the opposite lane. More often than not, this will force the opponents to spend some of their elixir on defense so that they won't be able to support their offensive push. If the opponent chooses to ignore that and goes in with a big massive push, the first step is to utilize the bomb tower to pull any sort of building targeting units in. Second, you want to space out your two ranged defensive units, and I'm talking the Dark Goblin and the Spear Goblin. Third, you're going to use the Golden Knight as a tank and utilize that Golden Knight dash to take care of any units behind the opponent's tank. Fourth, you can use defensive spells such as the Poison and Log to slow opponent troops down as well as deal significant damage. And finally, you can even use the Wall Breakers to kite the opponent's offensive units. All in all, a very fast and aggressive deck, so just keep that in mind when you're playing this deck. Number 4. Lava Hound spam. Now, with the recent buff, or rework rather, of the Tombstone, the Lava Hound deck is still better than ever. Starting out the match, I'm always playing this as a very aggressive beatdown deck. I go in with a Lava Hound very early in the match, may that be after the opponent makes a play, or even just as the first play of the match, because most of the times the opponent actually won't have that good of an answer to it, and that's just kind of the reality of this current meta. Breaking down the offense of this deck, very simple offense. I'm generally going to first support the Lava Hound with a single troop, bait out some of the opponent's counters, and then go in with the remainder of my support. For example, if I have a Lava Hound going down the lane, I'll maybe support it with just a single Mega Minion, wait for the opponent to use some of their counters, and then go in with my Balloon or with my Skeleton Dragons. This accomplishes two things. It means that you're not overcommitting on offense, so the opponent can't like plop some Elite Barbarians in the opposite lane and catch you on 0 elixir. Secondly, it spaces your units out so that the opponent cannot get spell value, which is the killer of all Lava Hound decks. Moving on to the defensive end of this deck, there really is just two main goals on defense. The first is you want to distract the opponent's ground units with the Tombstone and the guards, and then you want to damage down the opponent's units with your Mega Minion and your Skeleton Dragon. Tombstone is generally going to be more for those building targeting units, such as those giants and golems, and then the guards are more for those high hit point units, such as Elite Barbarians and Princes, but they're both just really good at distracting ground units. The Mega Minion and the Skeleton Dragon are both kind of weak to spells, so again, it's just very important to watch out for what spells the opponents have in cycle to pull off your defense. All in all, very simple and very aggressive deck to play, so again, that's just something to keep in mind. Number 5. Mega Knight Wallbreaker spam. Now, this is the newest version of Mega Knight Wallbreakers, which sort of combines a bridge spam archetype as well as a minor cycle archetype. Therefore, starting off the match, it's always good to be a little bit more aggressive, cycling a miner to the tower, splitting your Wallbreakers at the bridge, or cycling your bats in the back. Again, like most cycle decks, I'm trying to immediately get some chip damage onto the opponent's tower and force out a response from my opponents. Then I will generally move towards a more reactive and defensive approach. So if the opponent does go in with something heavy in the back, you have so many quick bridge pressure options, from the Prince to the Royal Ghost to the Miner to the Wall Breakers, but more often than not, I'm just going to be reacting defensively, forming a counter push, and then applying some pressure with my surviving units. So on the defensive end, Mega Knight and Prince are going to be your two big tanks, as well as high damage dealers. The Royal Ghost and the Mega Knight can deal with splash units as well. Bats serve as a great distraction unit, and then the Archer Queen is there as your high output damage. One important thing to keep in mind, however, is that your defensive options are actually going to be quite expensive, because if you go in with a Mega Knight, you're sometimes not going to have elixir for a Prince or an Archer Queen, but if you instead go in with a Royal Ghost, well, then you're more likely to have elixir for more defensive options. So again, just keep that elixir cost in mind. Moving on to the offense of this deck, I love the versatility that this deck offers, because you not only have the quick pressure of a Miner cycle deck, but you also have the big heavy pressure from a big bridge spam deck as well. In terms of the Miner chip pushes, well, those are pretty simple. Just some wall breakers at the bridge, or maybe even Miner bats. Very, very cheap and effective ways to apply pressure. And in terms of your big heavy pushes, well, those will generally be off of surviving counter pushes. And what's great is you can actually apply double lane pressure with a big bridge spam push down one lane and then a cheap Miner push down the other. The immense pressure that this deck offers makes it such an effective option. So definitely another top choice for this current meta.